Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG. I also serve in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or G-PST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scale and speed. This is being done by providing a coordinated and holistic approach to the necessary knowledge, education, and support to power system operators across the 5 action pillars. The foundation of the G-PST is a group of 6 system operators from around the world who are facing higher penetration of wind and solar inverter-based resources sooner than any other operators in the world. The 5 pillars of the consortium are research and peer learning, technical support, workforce development, technology adoption support, and open data and tools. ESIG is the lead on Pillar 1, and more information on the G-PST can be found at globalpst.org. As the lead on Pillar 1, ESIG would like to welcome you to the April monthly webinar of our joint G-PST Pillar 1 ESIG webinar series. This series is in addition to the regular ESIG monthly webinar series and focuses on the G-PST research agenda and associated topics being addressed in Pillar 1. Topics are presented by both the founding system operators and other advanced system operators active in Pillar 1, as well as members of industry and academia participating in the activities of the Research Agenda Group and the Research Advisory Committee of Pillar 1. An additional series of webinars on the other 4 pillars of the G-PST is also being provided on a monthly basis through NREL. For those of you who would like to learn more about G-PST and how to engage, please go to globalpst.org and click on the Get Involved tab. Further information on ESIG can be found at esig.energy. Next, I would like to go over a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For the Q&A, we use the Slido platform at slido.com. You need to open a browser window, go to slido.com, and enter ESIG26 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the questions on Slido to allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize the questions submitted. We plan to save about 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A at the end and then wrap it up at the top of the hour. An email with a link will be provided once the video file has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. Okay, so today our webinar is going to cover inertia monitoring. This is a topic which is gaining increased popularity as inverter-based resources start to displace synchronous machines and the connected inertia of the power system declines. Today's webinar will feature Julia Matevosyan, Chief Engineer at ESIG. Julia has more than 20 years of experience in the power industry, and prior to joining ESIG, she was the lead planning engineer at ERCOT. Julia received her PhD at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. She's a tremendous addition to ESIG, and I'm very pleased to have her here with us today. A number of methods for estimating and monitoring inertia have been developed over the past few years. Regardless of the methods being used, there's a need to improve situational awareness and accurately monitor available inertial response in real time. This webinar will briefly cover the need for inertia monitoring and methods that are currently being used or proposed around the world. Okay, just a short reminder once again to use Slido at slido.com with the event code of ESIG26 to ask your questions. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Julia, I'll now turn it over to you.
Can you hear me, Charlie?
Yes, I can hear you good.
All right. Thank you very much for introductions. Everybody, thanks for joining this webinar. So as Charlie mentioned, the webinar is on inertia monitoring, and we can jump straight in and go to the next slide. So just to level set about what inertia is. So inertia is kind of the resistance to change during generation trip events or load change events. So there is kinetic energy stored in rotating masses of all synchronous machines on the system. And if a generator trips, this kinetic energy is being used in the first moments after the disturbance to fill in the gap for the generator lost. And so as this kinetic energy is being used, then this results in synchronous machines slowing down and manifests itself as system frequency decline. And so what happens with if more and more inverter-based resources are being added to the system and synchronous generators retire or they are not committed at certain moments in time, then inertia starts falling, and so it may be lower than what people used to see before. And so here you can see schematically the first second of frequency decline after, let me grab a pointer actually. Yeah, so in the first second after a large generator trip event, if inertia is high, then rate of change of frequency is slow. And if inertia is lower, then rate of change of frequency is high. And so there is less time left for any frequency control measures to arrest frequency before some kind of issues happen on the grid. And so the issues that can happen is that, as I mentioned, there is not sufficient time for frequency response to respond, and that results in customer load shedding because frequency reaches under frequency relay settings. There can be loss of main protections that trips generation that is located on the distribution side. So specifically in national grid, in Great Britain, and also in Ireland and air grid area, there are these relays that are using rate of change of frequency as an indicator of an unintended island. And so settings on these generators is to trip if rate of change of frequency reaches a certain value. So that results in additional loss of generation in addition to initial event. And of course, this is not desirable behavior. Also under frequency relays may malfunction if rate of change of frequency is high. And so this is what happened in 2016 in South Australia blackout. Some of the under frequency relays didn't operate properly because rate of change of frequency was too high. Additionally, there may be issues on gas-fired generators and they may trip to too high rate of change of frequency. And so again, that may result in additional loss of megawatts that is not desirable. This relationship here basically shows the relationship between rate of change of frequency, system inertia, and size of generator lost. And so there are several levers that can be used to control rate of change of frequency, basically. And so you can bring additional inertia online, can change speed of response, change size of contingency, and change magnitude of response. So all of these levers are available to mitigate high rock-off. And so there are pros and cons for different measures to use. So the first one, skipping sufficient system inertia online. So basically bringing additional synchronous generators online just for inertia. And so because when you're bringing additional generator online, it brings additional megawatts because each generator will operate at certain minimum megawatt level. And so it has economic impacts, environmental impacts, and also higher costs because obviously those generators have been brought online just for inertia, and it means out-of-market commitment. Synchronous condensers with high inertia can be added to the system, but this is again, the con of this is that it's additional asset and it costs money, and this asset is only used for provision of inertia. Another advantage of this is that it can provide additional reactive power and voltage support, and it can be placed exactly where support is needed. Yeah. Then I mentioned protection settings, so this can be adjusted, and as an advantage of this is just that by adjusting protection settings, it allows operating system actually at lower inertia level. The downside of it is that it results in additional cost. And it's also time consuming to roll out. So in both the national grids in GB and in Ireland, it took substantial amount of time to go around and reset those relays. Then reducing size of largest contingency, again, the benefit of it is that system can operate at lower inertia level because you're basically reducing this delta P here that may happen in the worst case. The downside of it is that it means that it's uneconomic dispatching down of generation. So if generator already been scheduled to operate at this value and you're dispatching it down, it means that some more expensive generation elsewhere needs to come up to make up for this. Then implementing faster and more aggressive frequency response. Again, the benefit of it is that inertia costs will be less because you can operate at lower inertia, but then on the flip side of it, there are additional costs of faster frequency response and maybe carrying more megawatt of frequency response. And then last measure I have here is active power injection from inverter-based resources in inertia timeframe. So that's talking about grid forming inverters. The downside of it is, again, additional costs and technology is still being developed. But the benefit of it is that less of inertia is needed from synchronous generators, and also grid forming resources themselves can provide it. So if you're comparing this measure to adding a synchronous condenser is additional transmission asset, whereas grid forming resource is resource on its own. So it's make grid forming, it can provide active power injection that is comparable to inertial response from a synchronous machine. All right, so once kind of you figured out that inertia is going down and may be a concern, then the question becomes, what's the limit? What is inertia that is needed on the system? And this is where critical inertia or inertia floor may be set. And critical inertia is a minimum level of inertia that below which the system cannot be operated reliably with existing frequency control practices. And the criteria to determine critical inertia is that the largest loss of in-feed shouldn't result in involuntary under-frequency load shed. So when I'm saying critical inertia, it not necessarily means that concern is frequency nadir. The concern may be just too high rate of change of frequency, as I mentioned. So when evaluating this criteria, you need to think what is the limiting factor. So for example, if you lose a large unit, and then as a consequence, rate of change of frequency is so high that you lose even more generation on the distribution side, then it brings you to under frequency load shed, and this is not acceptable. So you need to bring your inertia level higher to the level where you can operate reliably, and losing a large unit doesn't cause under frequency load shed. And so here on the right-hand side, you can see an example for ERCOT system where critical inertia is defined as minimum inertia level that will ensure that load resources that provide frequency response on ERCOT system have sufficient time to respond before frequency reaches under frequency load shed. And so these load resources, these are large industrial loads with under frequency relays. This is not load shedding. They are actually providing an ancillary service, and they will trip within half a second after frequency reaching 59.7 hertz. So you can see here schematically, if a large event, which is loss of 2 nuclear units in our ERCOT system happens, then frequency travels to 59.7. At this point, the timer for under frequency relays on load resources start, and they have half a second to respond. And so if within this half a second frequency already reached 59.3, which is UFLS setting, then inertia was too low and this rate of change of frequency was too high. So basically for ERCOT system, they need to keep inertia such that this time here is higher than half a second. So why monitoring inertia is important. So first, the first step basically is inertia trending, and just to understand when additional mitigation measures are needed. The second step is situational awareness in real time and making sure that inertia stays above critical inertia level. So once you determine this critical level, then you need to make sure that inertia in real time is maintained above that level. Then to understand any frequency reserve needs. So for example, once inertia starts getting kind of low, you may find that during different inertia conditions, different amounts of reserves are needed or different speed of reserves is needed. And so inertia trends can be used to kind of figure out and come up with inertia with frequency response requirements. And then in real time, for situational awareness, inertia again can be used to make sure that you have sufficient amount of frequency containment reserves based on inertia conditions. So once all of this is done, then a system starts getting into lower inertia level and kind of hitting that critical inertia, close to critical inertia level from time to times, then actually accuracy becomes more important. And why is it important? It's because there is there can be less costs because you're bringing additional generation online, which is out of merit. There is less curtailment of clean and cheap power from renewables, and less megawatts or slower frequency response would be acceptable if you accurately estimated your inertia levels and you know how much you actually have. So on the right-hand side here, I have costs for managing rate of change of frequency in Great Britain. So as I mentioned, for them, a certain rate of change of frequency, maintaining it is the criteria, and that translates into inertia requirement. And you can see how over the years, the costs of maintaining needed rate of change of frequency has been grown. I wanted to mention here that the cost here includes cost of bringing additional inertia online, cost to redispatch and reduce largest generation loss or largest import loss if it's over HVDC line. And this also includes costs for resultant renewable curtailment. So say bringing additional synchronous generator online brings its additional megawatts that were not necessary on the system, and that results in any renewable curtailments, then it also results in costs for national grid. And so these costs are also included here. And you can see they've grown quite a bit over the years. In fiscal year 2021, it was actually very high, and to parts this is explained by COVID because the load was low, but renewable penetration was high, so inertia was low, and that resulted in high costs for managing rate of change of frequency. And then you can see that in the past year, in fiscal year 2022, which ends in April 2022, ends in March 2022. You can see that the costs decline substantially, and this is one of the reasons is that some of the resources that were awarded in the Stability Pathfinder, and they bring additional inertia to the system, but with 0 megawatts. So that reduces the additional costs for bringing additional synchronous generators online. And they also changed ways how they manage rate of change of frequency, and that resulted in some cost savings. Right, so inertia of the well-interconnected system, where synchronous generators are spread well across the grid, it's just, it can be monitored as just one value, because frequency in the entire system kind of changes in unison. All generators are rotating in unison, and it's not important to look at regional inertia. However, if you have long and skinny system, and here on the right-hand side, again, you can see Great Britain system, and you have pockets of generation, like concentrated pockets of generation on the system, then when generator trip events happens, it kind of acts as masses and springs, where masses are generators and springs are interconnectors between those generating pockets. And so you can see some regional behavior in the first moments after a generator trip. And so what you can see here on the right-hand side is a generator trip here in the kind of central to south part of national grid. And you can see how frequency varies across the grid in different places. And so if you look at initial rate of change of frequency right here in the first second after an event, you can see that in some areas rate of change of frequency is really low, whereas in some it's very steep and high. And so that can result in local rate of change of frequency issues. And so regional inertia basically means that areas that have lower inertia, they can experience higher rate of change of frequency after an event, and also areas that are close to where event happened, they will also experience large rate of change of frequency. The problem with this is if in this area you happen to have something that reacts to high rate of change of frequency, or even that the rate of change of frequency is so high that you hit under frequency load shedding trigger before any frequency control measures have time to deploy, then it can result in local events. And so in such systems, it's recommended to identify coherent regions, so regions where generators kind of moving together against generators in other parts of the system, and start monitoring inertia by region, and also determine what is the critical inertia in each region and if there are any local issues that may happen if rate of change of frequency is too high. EPRI has developed a graph theory-based approach to identify and analyze regions, and also seen some other publications in literature where different methods have been developed of how to define the regions. And then after that, it starts making sense to monitor inertia in each region. One other concern with regional inertia is that having fast frequency response in regions with low inertia may cause local instability. And so here you can see on the graph on the right-hand side that location of response with regard to disturbance becomes important to consider. So here you can see a case where large generator trips, and there are all synchronous machines on the system. So you can see how frequency events look like on the system like that. And then two traces, yellow and red trace, correspond to a case where you have 88% of inverter-based resources. And so in case one, inverter-based resources are located electrically far away from the inverter-based resources located electrically far away from disturbance provide response. And then in the case two, inverter-based resources located nearby to disturbance provide response. And so you can see that the case two is stable, whereas the case one is not stable because fast frequency response is provided from the area that has low inertia and high rate of change of frequency. And so EPRI has developed analytical methods on how to evaluate delivery of fast frequency response and how to determine if it can deteriorate system damping and what mitigations can be applied. So this is pretty cool. I just seen in the meeting that I had last week. So this is something to think about. Also, ERCOT just recently started a study looking at if there are any locational limitations for provision of frequency response from inverter-based resources. So they're basically concerned with this issue as well. So going into inertia monitoring methods, first at glance, there is a method that's based on unit commitment. So it sums inertia contribution from online synchronous generators on the grid. And most system operators today, they are concerned with inertia. Somehow they're already using this method, and that's ERCOT, EirGrid, IEMO, and also Nordic system operators. There is a variation of this method where it's based on unit commitment, but also uses an adjustment factor, which is estimating inertia contribution from distributed generation, distributed synchronous generation on the system, and also contribution from motor loads. And National Grid is using this method, and this method is more suitable for areas that have significant impact from load inertia and also significant amounts of synchronous generators connected on the subtransmission level. And then there is a continuous frequency measurement method, and there are two variants of this. One is where ambient signal, ambient frequency changes are being used to estimate inertia, and another one is where specific stimulus is being provided to the system, and it's known size and time of the stimulus, and that's being used to evaluate inertia. And both of these methods are now in final stages of implementation in National Grid in Great Britain. And then the last method is based on historic disturbance events, and that basically includes historic analysis of large disturbance events and evaluating inertia from it, and then trying to correlate it back to load patterns and generation commitment patterns, and trying to say, oh, now if I have a similar load, similar unit commitment, I might have similar inertia. This one is not very accurate, and it's not being used in real time normally, but it's being used to benchmark and calibrate other methods that are used in real time. All right, so now I'll just talk a little bit more in details about every method. So as I mentioned, the unit commitment-based inertia monitoring is simple, widely adopted, is a good estimate of system inertia for most systems. So kind of it's a starting point, is a good start. The downside of this method is that it only considers inertia of units that are being monitored. So if you have telemetry from transmission connected units only, that means that you are missing inertia and distribution units. It requires telemetry from units, and it requires inertia contribution from each unit. So what also may happen is that inertia data from generators may not be accurate, especially in some systems where you have older generators and it's maybe hard to get data. So there is some inaccuracy being introduced there. It's convenient for real-time monitoring, kind of very straightforward to implement. It also allows for forecasting if you have any information about what are generating units going to do in the next few hours, and you have inertia contributions of these units, you can use it for forecasting. And also to monitor reserve sufficiency. So as I mentioned, if you have your frequency containment reserves are based on inertia conditions, then you can use forecasted inertia conditions. You can look at how much reserves you have right now and figure out if you have sufficient amounts. So this is just an example of inertia monitoring and forecasting that have been implemented in ERCOT. It's implemented in the control room since 2016. They also monitor inertia by generator type. This is useful for trending, so you can see if certain generator types are retiring sooner than others, and kind of just a lot of valuable information there. It's used for inertia forecasting as well. So every generator in ERCOT system are submitting the current operating plan. It's updated every hour and spans 168 hours ahead. So it's an easy way to use it for inertia forecasting and provides pretty accurate forecasting for the next few hours ahead. And then ERCOT is using inertia in real time, inertia monitoring in real time and forecasting to evaluate sufficiency of frequency containment reserves. And for ERCOT system, I would also like to add that this is relatively suitable method because in ERCOT, all of the generation, all synchronous generation, or majority of it is connected on the transmission level, and ERCOT has a really good visibility of it. Then the continuous estimation based on frequency measurements. So here I have just some general principles, and then I'll go into specifics of each implementation. So generally frequency is continuously measured using some kind of high-speed measurement distributed across power system. And then signal processing and swing equation of a single machine equivalent are being used to estimate inertia. This allows system-wide inertia estimation or regional inertia estimation, whatever is needed. And in some of the methods, change of flows between regions is being used to estimate what was power change in each event, and it monitors continuous small changes and evaluates inertia on continuous basis. In other method, a stimulus is used to inject known but small delta P into the grid, and then because they know the size of it and when it was injected, it allows them evaluating inertia again using swing equation. This method captures inertia of load and distributed synchronous generation. It also can capture impacts from active power injection from controls on the system, so such as fast frequency response, governor response, etc. And so it can be estimated and removed if needed, or if the concern is only rate of change of frequency and you don't actually care where it comes from, if it's from inertia, if it's from frequency response, then you actually might not even care about removing these impacts from inertia signal. Going to existing methods for continuous inertia estimation. So one of the methods is from Reactive technologies. So as I mentioned, they use known disturbance. It's a periodic small active power stimulus that's induced into the system, and it has a negligible effect on the grid. So you can see the one that they are using in national grid is plus minus 5 megawatt ultra capacitor. So it's very small compared to, I believe peak load is maybe 60 gigawatt or more. So it's very small. It's invisible to human eye in the frequency signal. So it doesn't produce any major disturbance on the grid or something like that. And then they have a number of extensible measurement unit, XMU. So these are Reactive Technologies proprietary measuring equipment. It's small and basically plug and play. It plugs into just power outlet, and it uses internet, secure internet connection to feed data into the cloud where it's being processed. And so they extract signal from multiple locations. They calculate inertia using swing equation based on known delta P that they inject, and they know exactly when it was injected, so the timing of this disturbances. They measure rate of change of frequency and calculate inertia. It can be tuned to include or exclude active power control action, depending on what's needed. And I mean, the only downside of it is that it's costly because it requires additional equipment, as in this case, ultracapacitor. But on the other hand, it has increased accuracy with that because there is a known disturbance that they're injecting on the grid. So it's inertia estimation is more accurate. All right, so this method has been evaluated in a number of trials, and the most recent trial was a 21-day trial on an island of Great Britain that got disconnected because of cable, either maintenance or failure. I don't really remember anymore. They used inertia and frequency measurements to estimate loss of largest events, and what they demonstrated in this trial is that that island system was not always operating securely from largest megawatt loss perspective. So sometimes the largest loss would have actually caused under frequency load shedding. From inertia estimation, they could say that the largest loss needed to be controlled and reduced. So here you can see how the display looks like. It basically shows the largest loss right now, and it also has this risk. It shows risk for the system. So if you're starting to get close to having largest loss, that is kind of dangerous from an inertia perspective. And it also monitors inertia in real time, and then it also continuously showing traces for actual largest loss that you currently have, then forecasted from the day ahead perspective and intraday forecast, and same for inertia. So the current status, They're working on deploying this for the entire Great Britain system. Testing has been underway over recent weeks, and final improvements are being planned right now. Then the system will go live and will be tested for the next 1-2 months. And then after that, it will be implemented in the control room later this summer. And so another system for inertia monitoring that National Grid is also deploying in the control room is from GE. It's called effective area inertia. And so basically what they do, as I mentioned, they measure changes in flows on the tie lines between different regions, and they use these changes to determine small delta P changes on the grid. And at the same time, they have PMUs distributed across the grid to measure frequency. And so they use rate of change of frequency and known delta P, again, use swing equation and signal processing techniques to estimate inertia. And then they do event-based validation. So if large event happens on the system, they look and validate the inertia prediction versus what actually happened and how close it is. And they also do inertia forecasting, and this is looking at available on the market parameters such as demand, forecasted wind and solar production, and uses machine learning and also this learnings from inertia metering to provide inertia forecasts. And this is validated based on actual events that happen on the grid. So this method has been validated in Scotland based on 39 or so, I remember, 39 frequency events. So they look at estimated and forecasted inertia before an event and boundary power change between the regions, as I mentioned. And they use it to calculate rate of change of frequency, and then they compare this rate of change of frequency with what actually happens, and that provides a measure of accuracy of this method compared to reality. And so you can see here quite a good correspondence between measured rate of change of frequency and predicted rate of change of frequency. And the blue lines here, sorry, it's hard to see. The blue lines here are showing estimated rate of change of frequency, and the red lines are showing the ones that's based on forecasted inertia. So they've tried, the current status now is that they tried metering inertia online and forecasting for over a year now in Scotland. And so the next step is deploying PMUs in other regions in Great Britain. And then inertia forecasting that they do went live in October and now being kind of evaluated by engineers and will be rolled out in the control room ahead of summer. And then just quickly to mention that research organizations and academia, they don't have access to these proprietary methods of inertia monitoring, but they also need to do further research of, what you can do with monitored inertia and kind of continue the research. And so they come up with the ways to do it themselves. And so just to mention one of these methods is from EPRI. It's quite similar to what GE is doing. So it's also based on PMU measurements across the grid, and it uses power flow change on interconnecting lines between regions to determine how much power change has happened, and then evaluates inertia based on measured rate of change of frequency and estimated active power change. It uses system identification methods and uses ARMA-X model to identify parameters for the single machine equivalent model. And so, as I mentioned, estimates delta P, estimates rate of change of frequency, You can change a sliding window for ARMA-X model, and you can consider governor response provided. So you can subtract it from the estimated inertia and kind of have a pure inertia versus what's being provided through primary frequency response. And here you can see accuracy of the system. So it's 2% error. That's kind of most frequent. So it's fairly accurate, and this method has been tested on IEEE test system, I believe 39-bus test system. And then going to historic disturbance events, inertia estimation based on that. So again, system is being treated as a single equivalent machine. You use frequency measurements to estimate initial rock-off after an event happens, and then this rock-off is being plugged here, and you'll know what tripped after the fact, and so this is being plugged into delta P, and this is how inertia is being calculated. The problem with this method is that it assumes that there is only change in electrical power that happened, so it assumes there has been no primary frequency response or any kind of fast frequency response on the grid. And so everything that you see in the initial rock-off is inertia. And this method, therefore, is prone to error. Rock-off is also difficult to estimate during a disturbance. So it's looking at actual real frequency trace. It's sometimes hard to understand when exactly event happened. And this data is not available from any logs of generator trip, for example. So it's hard to say where is T0, from which moment you should start inertia evaluation. And it's also difficult to have a sufficient amount of clean events where you have just a pure generator trip. There was no power reduction before a generator tripped. So yeah, you need a big number of events before you can use this method. So this table here kind of summarizes all of the methods and pros and cons and input data needed. And you can look at this. This is produced by EPRI some time ago, but it's still valid. You can look at it after the webinar. And I'll just jump to conclusion to leave some time for questions. So what does all of this mean to somebody's system? So I just wanted kind of to step through, because I often get this question, or should I be worried about my inertia? Does it matter? When does it matter? And so this is kind of flow chart of the steps that you go through if you have this kind of question. So the first question is inertia declining? So am I getting a large number of inverter-based resources on my system and inertia start declining? And so if intuitively you think, yes, it does start declining because I'm getting a lot of inverter-based resources on my system, then the first step is start trending synchronous generator inertia. So you collect your inertia constants, you make sure you have visibility of online status of your synchronous machine on the grid, and start measuring and trending your inertia. At the same time, it's important to understand what are the limits. Are there any rock-off limitations, or are there frequency constraints? So what is the limiting factor? And based on that limiting factor, what is the lowest inertia that you can go down to? And so after that, you can start real-time monitoring based on unit commitment. And you can also use it for forecasting, as I mentioned, as they do in ERCOT, for example. And then once you start going closer to critical inertia levels, then you start running into rock-off mitigation instances where you have to take action to bring more inertia online. You need faster frequency response. You need maybe dynamic reserves for frequency containment. So it depends on inertia conditions. So this is where now it starts being converted into costs. So having either sufficient inertia online or faster reserves, now it starts to have costs. And so at that point, this is where accuracy starts playing a role. And so this is where you need to ask a question: if load has significant contribution to inertia and maybe you're not considering it, or if you have distributed synchronous generation that needs to be included. And then you can compare cost saving of including these effects versus costs that you are already paying for rate of change of frequency mitigations. And so if the costs, are such that it makes sense to implement this continuous inertia monitoring and invest into that, so such as what National Grid has done, you can put in continuous inertia monitoring and forecasting methods into your control room. And then another question is, do you have regional inertia issue? So is your system meshed such that frequency doesn't vary in the first instances after an event across the system? Then you don't need it. But if it does, then maybe you should consider regional inertia. And what are the risks in each region? So that's something you need to understand. If there are any local rock-off constraints, for example, and you need to keep certain amount of inertia in every region. And then from that moment on, then it makes sense to start monitoring inertia regionally and forecasting regionally as well. And then I think the next kind of level of question is, okay, I have implemented my fast frequency response. Is it being provided in right places? Maybe it's too fast for some of the regions with low inertia and can cause local instability issues. Maybe it's too aggressive, so maybe the droop is too high, and I need some limitations on fast frequency response in these regions, or I need to slow it down or have it with higher droop. And so all of this flow, it's basically, you need to keep reassessing it periodically because things keep changing. You need to continuously benchmark parameters of your inertia monitoring to actual events, disturbance events that are happening on the system. You need to keep in mind that load inertia and distributed generation inertia may change over time. So for example, more and more variable speed drives or power electronic interconnected loads are being used, and so maybe load inertia is actually declining. And then also definitions of regions may change as you get more inverter-based resources on the system and more synchronous generators retire. So with that, I'm ready for questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. You've answered a lot of questions already, but there's a lot more in the question box. So let's see if we can get through some of these here. There's a first one is actually a couple of related ones. Can you elaborate on using fast frequency response and how it causes stability issues? And then there's a related one. Can you further explain why fast frequency response in low inertia grids can cause additional instability?
So my understanding with it is if you have fast frequency response being provided in a weak grid area, so you have little amount of synchronous generation in this area and it's far away from the rest of the grid, I understand it can interact with damping on the system, and so it may cause oscillations on the grid. And so by slowing down that fast frequency response, you can address it. Or maybe moving it elsewhere.
Okay, a question related to ERCOT. Is anyone else in North America monitoring inertia in real time besides ERCOT?
I believe IESO is doing it and Hydro-Quebec is doing. I'm not sure if in real time or they are just trending, but I know they keep track of it anyway. Also, Alberta, AESO, so they have a concern. They normally are interconnected, but they have a concern if in winter one interconnector goes out and then they become an islanded system. So for them, inertia becomes an issue as well. So they monitor too.
Okay, it's picking up interest. Here's the question with no answer. What is the estimated percentage of inverter-based generation where the grid typically becomes unstable?
Yeah, no, it depends. I wouldn't even go that broad. I would just say even answering like where inertia becomes a problem, there is no just one answer for this, because say in ERCOT we looked at trends, how inertia is. We expected inertia to decline with increased amount of inverter-based resources, and it does the trend is kind of down, but it's not as fast as you would expect. And this is because you get load growth, your synchronous generation patterns may differ. So it's not that linear. It's not just that you get inverter-based resources and your inertia starts declining linearly. There are other factors that feed into that. But I would say like maybe after about 50% penetration, that's when you start at least thinking about it.
Okay, a measurement-related question, Julia. Measuring rock-off is challenging. Could be noisy and need measurements in more granular levels, more than 2 seconds provided by SCADA. Any ideas to overcome this?
So I mean, I understand in both methods they use much higher resolution data to estimate rock-off. So it's PMUs in one case, XMUs in another case. So it's I don't know how many, maybe like 30 samples, 60 samples per second. So it's not SCADA data that's being used. For historic event analysis, I think also PMU data is recommended, but if the SCADA data, all you have, that's kind of, that's where you run into issue where primary frequency response starts mixing in, because by 2 seconds you can get some amount of primary frequency response in your rate of change of frequency already.
Okay, a question from Janusz Bialek regarding National Grid ESO. Will National Grid ESO be using both reactive technologies and the GE method and compare the results and then choose which one is better?
I don't know. That's a question to Julian. I know they're going to use both. I don't know what the final idea with this is. I know the initial idea is to compare both and understand, you know, the accuracy of each. I don't know what the long-term plan is. Maybe if somebody from National Grid is on the line, they can answer in the Slido.
Yeah. Okay. Another question going back to ERCOT. What is the record percent generation of hourly inverter-based renewable energy in ERCOT to date? And what did ERCOT look like in that hour in terms of critical inertia?
So it's, if I remember correctly, 66% or so, that was the penetration record. That was in March last year and also happened in March this year, about the same amount, maybe 67%. From inertia perspective, I think, if I remember correctly, it's about 116 gigawatt seconds inertia, and critical inertia level is determined at 100 gigawatt seconds. So ERCOT never actually hit the critical inertia level yet, even though we determined it quite a while ago.
Okay. Question going back to its measurements again. Is there any comparison between estimated inertia value and tested value during an emergency? And how do you evaluate if they're accurate or not?
I think what they do, I'm not sure about if any of the 39 events say that GE tested was an emergency event. So, but these were large frequency events that happened. And so they basically, they use that same PMU information to evaluate rate of change of frequency that happened during an event. And then they use inertia estimate that came from the system for that time stamp, and delta P, estimated delta P for the timestamp, and they calculate rate of change of frequency based on that information. And so they compare rate of change of frequency that came from their data versus rate of change of frequency that actually happened, and that's how they validate accuracy of the estimation. And I believe Reactive does the same, and EPRI does the same in the test.
Okay. Here's a practical question. We're a utility interconnected with a few other utilities. We're monitoring inertia in our network. How do we monitor the inertia of the other connected utilities?
Yeah, I would just say just exchange information with them. I don't know how otherwise you would do that.
So everybody's got to measure his own and
share information. So that's basically what, say, Nordic grid is doing, because they are interconnected grid. Each one of them has monitoring of their own inertia, but they share it across the region because that's what matters.
And here's a comment more than a question. Great Britain ESO loss of mains project had to get vector shift protection removed and rock-off trip levels reset from 1/10 of a hertz per second to 1 hertz per second on lots of embedded generation. I guess that's a comment about what happened
That's
with
correct.
more.
I believe that
Yeah.
that just completed, maybe, you know, in last month or so. But it
Okay.
took maybe, I don't know, a couple of years to implement. That's why I was saying it takes time.
Yeah, all those manual relays that have to be reset.
Yeah, and the problem is that during that time you need to keep track of how much I've already reset, and you shouldn't worry about, and how much you may lose still if your rate of change of frequency is this small, it's like tenths of a hertz. It was 125 millihertz per second.
Here's a question that probably has several dimensions to it. Who are the major current providers or manufacturers of fast frequency response, the capable equipment, or grid forming capable inverters and batteries? So I guess, who are they? And there's another related question later about, do you know anything about price differences between this equipment? And I think probably another related question, Julia, would be what experience is there with the grid forming capable inverters and systems with high penetrations, like maybe those island power systems?
So I don't have data about cost. I would say the fast frequency response. So in my mind, when I was saying fast frequency response, I still meant where it's active controls, like where you measure change in frequency first, and there is some intentional delay, and then you respond. So that would be regular grid following resource. So battery would be better suited for it, because it would, you know, you would keep state of charge to respond. For wind or solar to provide fast frequency response, there need to be some kind of capacity reservation, and also yeah, like special controls on wind resource to provide fast frequency response. There have been some tests in 2017, 2018 timeframe that done by First Solar and NREL, where they demonstrated fast frequency response provision. ERCOT since went and required fast frequency response. I believe it's basically batteries aiming to provide that. Again, grid following batteries. Yeah, I believe some kind of like variations of fast frequency response exist in Ireland, Great Britain, and IEMO systems as well. And so like provided by batteries or solar resources, if they back down, for example, can provide it as well. And then going about grid forming. So grid forming, they provide extra fast frequency response. I don't even know how to say it. It's without intentional delay. It's say Great Britain's requirement for grid forming is within 5 milliseconds, if I remember correctly. So it's basically acts in inertial time frames as would be provided from a synchronous generator. That one, I don't have any results from Ireland's island systems, but there is a test, not test, but in real life event that happened in Australia where a coal-fired plant tripped. And they happened to be testing grid forming inverters, 2 grid forming inverters on horns. I forgot the name of this. There is large Tesla battery that's 125 megawatts in ERCOT's in IEMO system. Sorry, I forgot the name. And so they had these 2 inverters that had grid forming controls on them. And when event happens, you can see them providing active power injection way ahead of the nadir, whereas all other inverters are providing active power injection that looks more like a primary frequency response. So you can see the benefit of them providing faster response. And so the like grid forming offerings exist from I believe SMA, Tesla, GE, I think, and Hitachi ABB. That's from all I heard. But I know other manufacturers are also actively working on developing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure if you
Okay.
answered every bit of that question.
Oh, that's good. I'll take one more question. We're just about at the top of the hour. One that's near and dear to your heart, I know, Julia. At a NERC meeting, I heard that many grid-forming inverter systems' response has not been modeled correctly. Can we correctly predict IBR's response for events?
I think it's kind of mixed, that question. It maybe refers to disturbance events that happened, and I mean,
that's how I would take it, is the disturbance events.
That's how I think. So I mean, some of these things were not included. I mean, it can be modeled, but they were not included in models because either it wasn't considered important, or there is no specific requirement associated with those protective functions. And so people kind of didn't think it was important to model. All they were focusing on is showing compliance with existing requirements. And so I think this is kind of just going forward, looking at recommendations from these reports. People need to start thinking about that, you know, everything that's there in the inverter-based resource needs to go in the models. And then there are some phenomena that can be modeled in phasor domain simulations. There are other phenomena that can be modeled in EMT simulations. So the model has to be accurate and it has to be fit for tool that is being used.
Hard work to get good models, but it's worth the effort.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that ISO RTOs need to do more work on developing model quality tests and model validation procedures. So just kind of to be clear upfront what's expected from a model.
Yeah, that's a good response. So okay, we're just over the top of the hour, so we're going to need to wrap it up. Julia, thank you for a very interesting walk through the world of inertia monitoring. I think I learned a few new things. I hope everybody else did as well. As I mentioned earlier,
I just wanted to thank everybody who contributed. I collected information from people, so I wanted to thank National Grid, EPRI, and GE Consulting, and Reactive Technologies for providing information for this webinar.
Yeah, it's very timely and up to date. So I think you've been busy collecting all that. All right, and we'll send an email out once the video file has been posted, and we'll get the responses to the unanswered questions posted as quickly as possible. So for all of you, we appreciate your engagement, and if you'd like to stay engaged, I would invite you to participate in the May webinars and in the upcoming workshops on forecasting and markets and grid forming inverters in Denver, Colorado in June. Further information on the workshops and all the webinars can be found on our website at esig.energy under events, and you're all invited to attend. Information on all the G-PST webinars can also be found at globalpst.org. Julia, I want to thank you once again for this very timely webinar. Thank all of you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future. And in the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks again for your participation. Okay, bye now.
Thank you. Bye.